Before me today, I have two beautiful historic artifacts from the Greg Lamp collection in our upcoming August premiere firearms auction. Both of these items are connected to a historic figure from the American West whose life reads like a story out of a dime novel from the period. So we've got a beautiful Providence Tool Company Peabody Martini Killdeer rifle inscribed to the individual we're about to discuss, as well as his gold Leadville, Colorado presentation badge. Both of these historic artifacts were owned by Harvey S. Fawcett, also known as Arapahoe Harv, the Eagle of the Trail. The beautiful Peabody Martini that's inscribed to him is from 1877, while the badge is inscribed to him in 1884. The rifle's story isn't particularly very fascinating. The inscription on the left side here reads, H.S. Fawcett from Z. Chaffee for services 1877. The rifle's inscription directly relates to a fascinating story from the Old West involving both Chaffee and Fawcett. Fawcett and his friend Ranger Hank Wormwood were hired as guides for Professor Henry Newton, who was a geologist studying the Black Hills region in this time period. He was one of the leaders of the Newton-Jenny party that explored the Black Hills for the U.S. Geological Survey in the 1870s. This is during the Black Hills Gold Rush, which is basically what led to an influx of settlers into the Black Hills and then led to a conflict that erupted into the Great Sioux War of 1876. Along with Newton was his assistant, Zechariah Chaffee. Chaffee was also from the East, just like Newton, and had come out as basically a college kid to help out Newton during his exploration. That's actually something that happened relatively frequently during this time period. We have really cool pictures of like a Yale scientific expedition where you've got a bunch of college kids armed to the teeth with Sharps and Winchesters because they're going into the West to do geological studies, to dig up dinosaurs and things like this. And basically Wormwood and Fawcett were hired to act as guides and security for Newton and Chaffee. During their explorations, Chaffee would actually go out and hunt for deer and go fishing because he was kind of having an adventure in the West himself. He was living it up. He wanted to get as much adventure into his time in the West as he could. But a couple times he actually got lost and had to be rescued by Fawcett and Wormwood because he couldn't find his way. If you've ever been out into the Dakotas and you get outside of town like for miles and miles, it'd be very easy to get lost. So they actually saved him several times. But he did successfully bring back, venison and fish for them to eat, which they appreciated. But a couple times that actually brought back wolves, according to Fawcett's account of their adventures, and they actually had to fight off the wolves to prevent them from trying to attack the camp to steal the venison. Unfortunately, during his explorations, Professor Newton became sick. And despite his three friends' best efforts, he ended up passing away after reaching Deadwood in the Dakota Territory. This left Newton, Chaffee, and Wormwood with a problem. They could either bury Professor Newton somewhere in the West, far from his family, or they could take an arduous journey, nearly 300 miles to Sidney, Nebraska, where they could get his remains onto a train and sent back to the Northeast for burial. So together, they loaded his body onto a wagon and headed off to the east. The three men were naturally very concerned that they might be attacked during this long journey. On top of Native American raids that were still going on in the time period, they also had to worry about outlaws. There were, people that were robbing people in the time period. So you've got guys traveling around with little bags of gold they've found. So people walking around and riding around on horses that are happy to stick them up and steal that from them. So they're concerned about all this. And they've got a long open distance to travel with basically no security but their own Winchester rifles and 6-shooters they've got on their hips. Luckily, they actually made the journey with basically no incident. They did have another run-in with some wolves, and Fawcett indicated this time that they actually withheld their fire for fear of, attracting unwanted attention from some two-legged foes. So they make it to Sidney, they drop off Chaffee and Professor Newton's remains, and basically they probably are never going to see each other again. Wormwood and Fawcett would have to make the same journey now by themselves, just the two of them, back across the Badlands to Deadwood. After making the treacherous journey back to Deadwood, both Fawcett and Wormwood would go on to become lawmen. Unfortunately, Wormwood would only live a few more years and actually died in 1882. But Fawcett had a much longer career as a lawman, which we'll get to this badge in a few minutes, where we can talk about how that fits into the story. But first I want to explain how he ends up with this rifle. This rifle is mentioned frequently in letters between Chaffee and Fawcett. We have copies of letters from Fawcett to Chaffee that accompany the rifle, spanning from the late 1870s all the way into the early 20th century into his law career. So we know that shortly after returning to Deadwood, Fawcett would have received a letter from Chaffee, who had accompanied Newton's body back to the East, and then he remained in the East, where he became a prominent businessman. He wrote to Fawcett and Wormwood asking them if they wanted anything to remember the professor by. All they asked for in return was actually a photo of Newton, if they had one. Added to the bottom of that letter, in Chaffee's handwriting, is, "The best presents will be 2 Providence Tool Company rifles, properly engraved." Properly engraved is like underlined, like multiple times. And there's the name Burroughs, who's most likely the individual that Chaffee was forwarding this letter to say, hey, I need 2 rifles for these guys. And we know that they soon then received the rifles all the way back in Deadwood. By November 22nd, 1877, the rifles had reached Deadwood, and Fawcett wrote back to Chaffee saying, "I am well pleased with my gun, and must congratulate you on your judgment in choosing a gun for the frontier, more especially on account of the caliber, amount of powder, etc. I am unable to express my feelings of regards to the giver, for such unmerited tokens of friendship, but suffice to say I will ever keep my gun in grateful remembrance of the giver, and trust Hank will do the same. I have not had any photos taken yet, but as soon as I get rested and cleaned up a little, get some with a rough off, I will have some taken. The one Hank sent was taken at the RC agency, but in a short time I will send you one. I don't want to get any unless they are good ones, and the artist here now is not good. But there's a new gallery fitting up. As soon as this is done, I will send a negative." Just like he said in the letter, Fawcett did have a picture taken, in full buckskins with this rifle laying across his lap. That is presumably the photo that he sent back to his dear friend, all the way back in the East, hundreds of miles away, probably thinking he'd never see him again. But they continued to correspond over the years. Like I said, the letters span from 1877 all the way through into the early 20th century, into World War I, and the rifle keeps coming up again and again. Later in his life, Fawcett told a tall tale version of that crazy adventure in 1877, not knowing the person he was telling the story to was going to print it in the newspaper. So there's a newspaper account of the same expedition, of the same journey across the Badlands, but in the newspaper telling, they come under fire from the Native Americans. They fight them in a running battle for over 200 miles, which is insane. You could not fight a running battle for 200 miles. But in the story they did. And the story has them firing back with their Winchesters, taking out the Indian ponies, shooting, one of the lead riders at like 500 yards, all kinds of extravagance that just plain didn't happen. And at the end of the newspaper article, even the fantastic tale, Fawcett brings up this rifle and notes that Chaffee had this rifle sent to him. So you can tell, even when telling a tall tale, he wants to bring up this rifle. That's how proud he is of it, and how beloved this rifle is to him. It's one of his most prized possessions, very clearly. And he actually said he had to write Zach Chaffee and tell him, like, my bad, basically. I shouldn't have told a tall tale. If I had known they were going to print it, I believe his phrase is, I would have given them the proper data. So basically kind of excusing himself, like, oh, I didn't know. So he writes to Chaffee frequently, and he basically tells him, hey, I'm going to write down my frontier experiences. In April of 1913, in one of his letters, this rifle comes up again. Fawcett wrote, I still have the old rifle you sent me, and love it as a true and tried old friend. And 5 years later, during World War I, he writes to Chaffee again talking about this beloved rifle. This time he writes, I am now 73 years of age, but there is a betting chance that we will have yet to fight the Germans here at home, and in this event I am ready to go and help the boys. Later in the letter he notes, the peep sight I want is for the back sight. I have all in place but the peep or thumbscrew sight. So what he's referencing there, if you take a look at the rifle, is the back sight here on this Peabody Martini has a notch where you can fold it up, and it would have had a peep sight that slid along here. This was evidently lost. So he was writing to Chaffee asking if he could get a replacement for it. Based on the rifle's condition now, we know that he probably never had it. I mean, in 1918, these rifles are long out of production, so it would have been hard to find a replacement sight. But that story tells you a lot about who Fawcett was as a man. I mean, this is a guy who was willing to fight the Germans in the Rocky Mountains at the age of 73 with a single-shot black powder cartridge rifle. That's his dedication to his country. That's his dedication to his friends and family. This beloved rifle would have been his trusty long-range gun during his law career. So after he made the treacherous journey back to Deadwood, he worked in freight for a little while, and then he bounced from like lawman job to lawman job around the West. He actually went back to Indiana at one point. He actually goes up to Seattle, Washington for a little while. But much of his time is still spent in Colorado. Most importantly, in the booming frontier gold rush town of Leadville, Colorado. In 1884, he was elected the city marshal and presented this beautiful gold presentation badge. So if you take a look at the badge itself, it's gold. It's got his name inscribed on it. It's got diamonds around the middle design. Just a beautiful work of art from the American West that ties directly to a historic lawman. One of Leadville's 40,000 residents. 40,000 is a big town in the West at this time period, but one of those residents was none other than Doc Holliday. Holliday came to the town in the 1880s and was, working the card tables in the saloons, which naturally leads to trouble. Bartender Billy Allen of the Monarch Saloon was going to be coming looking for Holliday, who owed him $5. And Allen wanted either $5 or a shootout. Unfortunately, Allen actually arrived on the scene before Fawcett could get there. And a shootout is exactly what he got. Holliday hits Allen in the arm and wounds him pretty seriously. Then the law shows up on the scene after shots are fired. They have to arrest Holliday, charge him with a crime. He's ultimately acquitted. Basically, at that point, Fawcett steps in. He's the big lawman in town. He steps in and tells Holliday, "You better leave town to avoid future bloodshed." And that's exactly what Holliday does. He moves on, heads off to Denver. These are just two stories about Fawcett's time in the West. Like I said, he was there for decades, and he was active during that whole time period. But these are the stories that are most relevant to this incredible rifle and this beautiful badge. If you go in and look up Fawcett and start reading about him, you'll find out that he had all kinds of adventures in the West. He was involved in other shootouts. There's rumors that he was directly involved with, the lead up to the Battle of Little Bighorn, that he was going to try to warn Custer that there was a big Indian village and there was going to be trouble. There's stories from the expedition that say he angered Calamity Jane and was one of the only men to ever anger her and not get shot, basically. Those are just some of the examples. There's tons of other ones. Like I said, his legal career spanned a long time. So Fawcett lived a long and eventful life, and he kept these two items with him to the very end. And he left them to his family, and they remained in his family for a very long time. When they came out, relatively recently, these items were out of the family, and now they're available at auction publicly. So anybody can bid and own these historic artifacts. You've got a beautiful Peabody Martini Killdeer rifle, personalized, inscribed directly to a frontiersman in 1877, right after the Battle of Little Bighorn and the Great Sioux War. And then you've got a gold badge inscribed to a city marshal in a legendary gold rush town in Colorado. What more could you want? And these are just two historic artifacts in the upcoming August Premier Firearms Auction. These are honestly probably two of my favorite that we've had in quite a while because the story is just so rich and exciting. Fawcett's such a character. When you read through all of the documentation that was included by Greg Lamp for these items, you really get a sense of who this man was as a lawman, as a friend, writing to Chaffee, who gave him this rifle for decades, constantly reminding him how dear he was to him, even though they only saw each other again, as far as I can tell, one more time in their lives. So great distances, great periods of time separated them, but they remained close friends, in part because he held this rifle probably frequently over the years and was constantly reminded of their adventures together. For collectors of black powder single-shot cartridge rifles, some of the most iconic weapons of the American West, the Buffalo rifles, you need a Peabody Martini in your collection. And most of these rifles would have remained in the East. They wouldn't have seen the Rocky Mountains. They wouldn't have been out on the northern plains. But we know this rifle was there. And not only do we know that, we know who it was carried by. A historic frontiersman who acted as a guide on historic expeditions in the West directly after the Battle of Little Bighorn. While the West was dangerous and wild, he was carrying this rifle in .45-70, the legendary Frontier caliber. So this is a beautiful historic Western artifact that covers so many of the bases we love in collecting. Both of these Western artifacts are available in our August 2023 Premier Firearms Auction.